Welcome everyone. Well, this isn't normally what this room looks like, but it's a big improvement. It's lovely to have you all here. I'm Tracy Mellor, partner at RSHP and member of the RIBA Awards Group.
I'm Amin Tahar, chairperson at Group Work. This event is part of Building Stories, a series of digital and in-person evening events at which our invited architects share with us their hard work, their thinking, their experiences, and hopefully some innovations that we can take away.
Absolutely. And we're delighted to be joined tonight by the 6 2022 Stirling Prize shortlisted practices. They will reveal the stories behind their buildings, and each practice will have 12 minutes to describe their design process from conception to completion and why their project should win the Stirling Prize. So no pressure. Then you, our lovely audience, will have 5 minutes to ask your questions at the end of each presentation. But first, before we get going, I'd like to welcome Mika Jones from RIBA Awards team to tell us a bit more about the Stirling Prize and this year's process.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm Mika Jones, and it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Stirling shortlist. I have the privilege of going on visits and seeing these buildings in all their glory. I want to give a short explanation of the RIBA Awards process and how we reach the Stirling Prize shortlist itself. In January of this year, almost 400 projects were submitted and duly shortlisted and visited by our regional juries. Our awards group then reviewed and visited these projects for national awards and worked with the chair of the Stirling Prize jury, Simon Alford, to reach the final 6 we will hear about tonight. I hope you enjoy the evening. Back to you, Tracy.
Thank you very much. So, should we get going? First up, we have 100 Liverpool Street by Hopkins Architects, a project that's totally reinvented a well-known 80s office building into a flexible commercial building and is British Land's first net zero carbon development. So I can't wait to hear about it. I'd also like to say it's greatly improved my daily walk to and from Liverpool Street, so thank you for that. Talking about this building, is Jim Greaves and Mike Taylor from Hopkins Architects, and joining them is Gareth Roberts from British Land. Over to you.
Good evening. Before you hear from Hopkins, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes from the British Land perspective to give you some of the context behind the vision and the brief for the project. Broadgate, when Hopkins came on board, Broadgate was in its 30s, and like many things, when it hits its 30s, needs a bit of a refresh. There were many things about the original master plan for the campus that were good, that we wanted to keep, like the pedestrianisation in the public realm. But there were some things that needed improvement, some of the defensive architecture, navigability, things like that. And we'd had a changed context around us over the time of Broadgate's existence. We'd have the rise of Tech City at Old Street, the nighttime and weekend economy at Spitalfields, the cultural attractions of the Barbican. So when we thought of Broadgate as a campus, we came up with a vision. And we said that we wanted to transform Broadgate and its wider neighbourhood into a 7-day-a-week mixed-use central London destination. Sorry. And we wanted to do that over a 10-year period through 16 development projects. And 100 Liverpool Street is the largest in the first wave of those projects. We wanted to keep the good bones that the building had that were technically capable of being kept. But we wanted to address some of the functional and aesthetic obsolescence for the building. 100 Liverpool Street is in a prime position in the City of London. It's at the gateway to the UK economy of the city. And with that prime position comes some significant constraints. It's adjacent to the station. We wanted to keep the existing structure. Tube lines run underneath the site. We've got a bus station with our footprint. Network Rail own half of the low ground floor of the retail, and they're a pleasure to work around. 4 other buildings on our campus are served by the basement gyrator, which has got to be live during construction. We have public art that we need to work around during construction and create a better environment for in the longer term. We've got strategic views, and we need to protect the levels of daylight and sunlight to public spaces. We've got circulation again, during construction, managing that and creating a better user experience for people when they use it in the future. And we had Crossrail within our footprint as well. So we had a huge number of constraints for Hopkins to tackle as part of the brief. So when they joined us, this is what they had, something that was functionally and aesthetically obsolete but technically had some good bones that we could take forward. Jim.
Thanks, Gareth. I'm Jim Greaves. So the first slide's just showing you the Broadgate estate that before it started to change, this was the estate that the Queen would have opened in 1991, and the site is here. So this was 8 to 12 Broadgate, and this is 100 Liverpool Street. And I remember as a young architect the buzz about Broadgate and what Stuart Lipton and Peter Foggo were doing down there. They'd imported these American fast-track procurement and construction techniques, and they built this scheme at a staggeringly fast rate. And actually, you know, I understand well the argument that raged about whether it should be listed or not. It's a very homogeneous scheme as an assembly of buildings and public spaces, public realm and public art. It's very good, and it was felt worthy of listing, but individually each of the buildings wasn't felt worthy of listing. And so basically in April 2011, the City of London blew any ideas of listing this scheme out of the park when they consented 5 Broadgate, which was a quantum shift in scale and quantity in terms of the development on the site. So when I first arrived at Liverpool Street, we entered the competition in 2012. It's been going on for a while. I arrived at Liverpool Street. You couldn't actually see Broadgate. I mean, it is there behind those windows, but you couldn't see it. And once you did find Octagon Mile, you basically had to shimmy your way up through a very congested, it was originally 15 metres wide, but it still is, but it got filled with kiosks. Because there was a ramp on it, because of this fast-track technique was a bit mean when it came to building basements, and they put ramps in. There were steps and handrails everywhere. And what few shops there were at the far end were sort of shoehorned into the basement, and with an appalling access. So really, I mean, this really did need to be changed. And by the time you got to the Fulcrum, which was designed by the American artist Richard Serra, you had a choice, you go left or right. There you go, choice, left or right. We very quickly realized that there was a lot of potential here. Instead of turning people into the circle, which was getting more and more congested, and with the advent of Crossrail, bigger buildings, much more people, we needed to come up with a different idea. So we realized that by lowering Richard Serra's artwork and the whole Octagon Mile by about 3 feet, you could actually carry on at the lower level and push straight through to the adjoining site, 1 to 2 Broadgate. And then go west down Eldon Street or north up to Hoxton and Shoreditch. And so that's what we put together. Firstly, what we decided to do was choose a datum from Liverpool Street and just push it straight through to the Fulcrum, remove all the kiosks. And we knew through visuals that we were undertaking that would be quite effective. So what we did was we put in three levels of shops and restaurants and enlivened the whole thing, created a new gateway, a new retail arcade. And then we took the 2 entrances off 100 Liverpool Street and 8 to 12 and combined them in a reception which overlooked the Fulcrum. Anyway, so AHMM have adopted that strategy in 1 to 2 Broadgate, driving this sort of new gateway through, creating a new arterial route. And actually, the main beneficiary of that will be the Circle, which will revert back to being a place that people can dwell in rather than a place that commuters pass through. And before I hand over to Mike, I just put this space syntax diagram in because it obviously was charting the flows of the people in and around before any of the development took place, and has a sort of water quality to it. And that was one of the antecedents that really set up this sort of dynamic, sinuous form that has wrapped the entire building. And I'm going to pass over to Mike now.
Thanks very much. So, Mike Taylor, Hopkins Architects. We had the chance here to reimagine this building and give it a new identity, and we were keen to bring in this kind of eroded feel of the shape and the circulation and soften the edges of it. And we did that by taking the existing structure and sort of amplifying it, moving the cores, moving the atria, which were on the outside, into the middle. So the red columns are the existing structure, and the green columns are new structure. And what we did, we took the heavy granite facade off and we used the lighter facade to buy us a bit of capacity in the sort of latent capacity in the structure. And we fleshed out that building and created this new form off that same foundations and same structure. And in fact, on the left, you see the structure we removed, the remaining structure, which was 100% of the foundations, 50% of the superstructure, and on the right, you see what we built on top of that. We kept all the floors. We added 3 new floors on the top and slightly reset the way that the servicing in those sandwiches worked. And there in purple, you see what we added. And between the plan and the section, we managed to add 45% extra of the NIA. So we had latent capacity in the foundations that had never been used. And due to the quality of the records that are being kept, we could now effectively build this extra accommodation on top of the previous structure. And the reason we could do this, the foundations were somewhat consolidated over time, but they had kept amazingly accurate logs. And because it was fast-track construction, they had kind of overdone the safety factors because they started building and they weren't quite sure what they'd be putting on top. So with that fast-track 80s method, things moved quickly. Okay, we're now down in the basement. To get all the bikes in, we excavated down. We couldn't put ground source heat pumps in because we had to work with the existing basement and the foundations. Okay, so we're going to work our way through the building. This is the network rail. That's the famous Boots store, which we had to keep open during construction. Next. Above that, we have a bus station, which we had to keep active, which Gareth has mentioned. So the building sits above that. Above that bus station, between the trusses, we had to squeeze in bike changing accommodation, which you see behind those louvers on the right. These are the bike changing. These are very high quality bike changing spaces. We've got 750 bike spaces, 65 showers, all part of the offer of a modern office. Obviously, the building's situated over a station and fantastic transport connections, but we need to encourage cycling at every opportunity. Moving up, this is the reception level. So you've arrived up the escalators on this large reception. The dark blue is the floor plate with the rearranged cores. See there on the section where we are. And then as we move up the building, every floor actually is different from the preceding ones as it starts to change its shape, as we sort of sculpted out and eroded away both inside and the outside of the building. And that's really important because it's a very big building. It's a sort of piece of landscape in the city almost. And where people passed and moved and circulated, we started to carve out. So here you see the bottom of the atrium, which is elliptical, and the stair in and the lift core connecting up. Those floor plates can be divided into 2, 3, or 4 subdivisions, so it's very flexible. The building is 100% let, which is good. So as you go up, you'll see the atrium shrinking as we push the sides in. So you'll see on the section on the left, we started to terrace back on the upper levels, which is partly about maintaining levels of sunlight and daylight, bringing in greenery and amenity at the top of the building, very important. And there's a kind of nice thing happening where you've got people underneath the building and people on top of the building. So it's fully colonized. And this helped break down the massing. As we get to the top, you see those terraces stepping back. On the 9th floor, we have a restaurant, and you can get to it from within, or there's a doorway at the bottom from the public realm that takes you straight up to the restaurant. That restaurant on level 9 has a roof terrace that looks back over the circle. There we are. And as you see, St. Paul's Heights in the distance. You see the plant rooms on the top, which we gave the same elevational treatment. We didn't really feel louvers were quite right on top of this. On the right there, you see the top of an atrium, which brings daylight into the center of the building. The facades are faceted glass, and one thing we learned from doing the velodrome was that actually if you put a piece of metal between the facets, you can get a very strong sense of curvature. So as you look at the building head on, it's transparent. When you look at it obliquely, it's opaque. And then you pick up some really nice kind of refraction, reflection, and shadowing. And it's very dynamic. It's a taut, modern skin on a kind of building, and that skin floats above ground level. The existing steel column, there you see the kind of velodrome technique of using the wind posts, which help with the structure of the glazing system. People have said, well, no, it's 100% glazed building. How can you possibly do that? It's not. It's 60% transparent and 40% insulated behind the glazing, which we optimized by looking at daylight transmission, heat gain, heat loss. And that was the kind of sweet spot we worked out with the engineers' BDSP. And then we worked quite hard on the solid glass to give it some interest, so we sort of got some depth to that and some shadow, and the insulation sat behind that. The notable fact for the building is we're 389 kilograms per square metre in terms of carbon, which is exceedingly low when you compare it to any of the targets by Letty or RIBA, and that's because we're sitting on top of the existing foundations and kept 50% of the frame. It is a big building, and we did everything we could, as I say, to erode the kind of landscape of this architectural way, and so I'm going to just take you through a series of slides now that would take you through the building. You can go there, you can go inside and get a cup of coffee. So if you're down there, just go in and go up to the reception. There's the main entrance. Here's the entrance by the bus station. Here's the entrance from the circle. Oh, we're going on time now. You go in and there's a series of escalators. We did break the first rule of officers, which is to put the reception above ground floor level. You come up, and then you get glimpses into the atrium. The stair and the lifts all connect in there. And I think very importantly, for an office building, you see all the other tenants, you see into their space. So there's a shared sense of ownership of that floor, but you get visual connections between the floor plates. And here you now see the top of the Richard Serra from the reception. And you get this idea of moving up. And most office buildings have a core in the middle. This one has light and space and a vision across to everyone else. As spotted by Victor and exploited by Victoria Beckham. And then as you go up, you get views out, you see the greenery, and it looks and feels like a new building, but it's not. And we had to work very hard at that. So the mullions actually held up that atrium roof in this case. And there you see that this becomes sort of part of the composition of Broadgate. And just quickly on the interior, we took the old station, the goods yard that had been on the site previously, before the 86 building, and sort of with UDS worked on that to generate an interior identity. And then just finally, I think the great thing about the building really is this visual connectivity that you see in and you see out and you see back to the building itself. And it's 500,000 square feet, so it's very big. And it's the size of most of those towers you can see. By being low level and connected to the city, it's an active place inside and out.
Thank you very much. So now's the opportunity we have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. I can hardly see you out there, but feel free, please don't be shy. I mean, while you're thinking of a question, one thing that's really struck me is how well it reconnects with the public realm and the work you did on the levels, particularly, I can't believe you lowered that sculpture, but it really has made such a difference. It works so much better. You reused 50% of the frame. Was there a point where you considered knocking it down, or was that always the plan?
Shall I answer that one?
Well, you can.
I mean, it was like a bit of kind of precarious dentistry, really, where they were kind of hanging onto a bit of your tooth to, so you could say it's still yours. There was a lot of temporary steelwork brought in to prop it that then could go off and be used for something else. It was a really difficult build, and like all the other shortlisted schemes, we had Brexit and a pandemic to deal with as well. So it was really tough. Okay. I'm sure financially it would have been cheaper to knock it down and start again.
I'd just like to say one thing. When we were working on this scheme, I couldn't quite work out why we had ramps. I mean, why did we have these ridiculous half levels? Why did we have to do something like lower a sculpture by 3 feet just to get a sensible strategy? And it's all to do with the fast track technique. They basically were so keen, Stuart Lipton and Peter Falkirk, to get these floor plates up. I think they didn't really want to build much basement. And that's a bugbear with the whole scheme, is to get the basements working properly.
Excellent, thank you. So is there a question out in the audience? Please stick your arm up if there is. And yes, there is. There's a Harry. Oh, I don't know you. Could you introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Hi, I'm Harry from RSHP. The sculpting for the pedestrian flows, did that clash with the wind modelling at all for keeping the wind speeds down?
No, I mean, we had to check, obviously, with the big kind of void underneath the building, whether we have a funneling effect. And actually, it all worked quite well that we didn't. I'm guessing the kind of wind speed on the surface was broken up by the fins, which are 300 mil, and that probably helped just sort of deflect some of that local wind. But we tested all of that, and fortunately, it didn't end up determining the form.
I think the other point is it's so surrounded by urban blocks. The wind's sort of like going over the top. It's not like dealing with a high-rise, which sort of catches it and projects it back down again.
I think it's probably another point against a tower. You know, if you go very high, your terraces are not very usable, whereas those ones generally are.
All right, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Right, thank you very much, guys, and I will now hand over to Amin.
Well done. Our next shortlisted team is Henley Halebrown. Come up.
Good evening. So Noel's going to join us for questions. I'm Simon.
Just jump straight in.
So this is a project in two parts, or two buildings in a way. It's a school, a free school, a primary school for 350 pupils, and an apartment building. And the kind of the project came about, I suppose, as a hybrid project, because the school had to pay for the land, and the school couldn't pay for the land, hence the housing. So they both fund the project. And it's a very prosaic way of starting, but in a way it explains a kind of curious combination. They replace a fire station on the site, and the fire station is on a busy junction on the Kingsland Road, just at the southeast corner of the de Beauvoir town, which was developed in the 1820s after the Grand Union Canal and the Kingsland Basin were cut. So it's a very sort of specific time. We are working within the Kingsland Road Conservation Area and adjacent to the de Beauvoir Town Conservation Area. Very quickly, these kind of series of sketches start to explore this question of how you, I guess there are versions where people have put schools under housing, and we wanted to keep the two things very much apart, create a courtyard school and use the housing in a way to protect the school from the busier street. But also this sketch starts to look at, I suppose, how you make a public building, or at least a civic building out of a school. It's not strictly a public building. And if you can, could we use the school hall a bit like a church to form the face of the school? As this is the building as finished, in the sense of as a drawing, where there's a kind of obviously a very different scale between the two buildings, but they share a language, a material language, and a language of, I suppose, primarily how you make openings, how you make thresholds between interiors and exterior, and the city. So it's a courtyard school. The logic being, could we essentially get the gross area of the school to be as close as possible to the net area, push all the spaces to the perimeter and make the very largest possible playground in what's otherwise, of course, an inner city school, inner city site where there's very little space. And there's a whole series of other things that trickle out of that kind of efficiency. One of which is actually it yields, we were able to build more teaching spaces. The school has a specialism in music, and so we were able to create 3 extra large teaching spaces. So the school's on the left, the hall to the south, a range of classrooms to the north, and the various classrooms and so on. And then the housing is sort of on the right. And the entrance to the school is in a way very clear as it stands between the hall and the tower, but in other ways actually quite benign. You can't see in unless you peer in close. There was a sense that we needed to create a very clear threshold between the city and the courtyard. It's a threshold both of, in terms of sort of how we designed the gate, but also how we made space, using that depth between the street and the courtyard, which is the depth of the hall. And this was a collaboration with a Sheffield-based artist, Paul Morrison, who for the last couple of decades at least has been using the iconography of woodcuts for his work. And then we took his drawing and turned it into a kind of pattern that could then be translated into an aluminium screen. And of course, it's the light in this case that conveys the imagery. The imagery being of a spider's web and a dandelion, which kind of marks the threshold between, I guess, the city and the world in microcosm, which is the school. So as well as the gate, there is then this space, which is a fairly three-dimensional, as it's an outside space, but has volume that leads you then into a courtyard, which is, as well as efficient, of course, what it's doing, I suppose, is it's exposing every classroom directly to the outside. So there's that kind of direct connection with nature, which is has become a kind of pedagogical device that, I suppose, I believe that sustainability is essentially it's a metric exercise. It's something which is benign and often hard to convey, whereas what we're interested in is the palpable, tangible, engaging, and even participatory aspect of sustainability. So this is a space that reminds the children of the time of day, the time of year, the seasons, so they have. It's something they can begin to understand their kind of role, especially when we're talking about other species and so on. But also, it's an efficient and healthy way of getting around the school. Even the circulation, the vertical circulation, the staircases and so on, as well as the galleries, everything is outdoors. This section just shows the larger classrooms on the north side on the ground floor, the smaller classrooms above, and then the hall on the south side acting as kind of buffer to the courtyard and the classrooms, but also some classrooms on top. So all of those spaces are dual aspect, with the capacity there for cross ventilation and a very natural environment, not least because there is no kind of intermediary space between room and exterior. So this is under construction, the north range of classrooms, which are paired. The upper story have south-facing windows and north lights, as it were, in the roof. The lower ones are lit from the back, which you might have noticed, as well as the front. And then there's a kind of constellation of fenestration, which is both through this very deep, 0.8 of a metre deep wall, which gives you, not structures, but I suppose if you think of someone like Bailey Scott and his idea of the hall, that the perimeter of the room starts to convey ideas about how you inhabit the room. In a way, not that surprising in a primary school classroom, but a kind of reading corner. But little things like by the front door, the hatch that allows a teacher to have a conversation without having to open the door, so when parents come to pick up their kids, they're not actually having to kind of stop them from bursting out the room, but also to be able to kind of manage ventilation and so on. And then on the outside, that middle window becomes like a shop front or a stall, and the reception kids take that quite literally and kind of set up their stall in the kind of threshold between their room and the kind of wider, the courtyard, the wider school. One of the I mentioned earlier, the capacity, the net to gross efficiency enabling us to yield more spaces, and this is one of them. This is the smallest of them. Here I'm looking south across the courtyard at the hall, and then a row of classrooms on top and a garden on top of that. And the hall, its position is I mentioned earlier, the idea that in a way it's the face of the school, but also it's a kind of a buffer. Not only is the housing a buffer to the noisier street, but even the hall is a buffer to the less noisy street. And it's lit by a necklace of clear-story lights on three sides. But you'll notice that on the right-hand side, it has a kind of blind story, so there is no issues of people on the street looking in, which generates this section or this wall construction where we kind of make a virtue out of that solidity and turn that ground floor wall into a bench. And this, again, is another kind of I suppose one of the really important parts of the project, the idea that you can that a school can be seen to be social infrastructure, that you can embed this, not only the benches inside the school, but you can embed this in the space outside. Just keep an eye on the time. But the point being that, especially for those who've had small kids and, you make friends for your kids then make friends for you, it becomes a virtuous circle. So at the end of the day, the parents are just sat on the quieter south-facing street having conversations and making friends before the kind of ritual moment that the school opens at the end of the day. So this kind of civicness or publicness of the building is borrowed. I mentioned here, it's a relatively small building, the school, but it's borrowed from the housing, and it's borrowed from the way the housing, the apartment building meets the ground through this heavy red granite and sand precast arcade, which I guess is also a kind of conveys the idea of not only, I suppose, about social space, but the solidity and durability and dignity that comes from how you make and detail a building. Just briefly on the housing then, it's a simpler thing to explain maybe, but it started out as a cube. This is a model of it in its sort of latter form. But essentially what started to happen was we explored ways of I suppose breaking it down into smaller pieces, so it's like a bundle of little towers, and one tower is most prominent in the southeast corner at the crossroads, and then there's a sort of diminutive order and geometry as the plan actually was addressing some very practical problems, but also sort of speaking to the master plan of the early 19th century de Beauvoir town. So from left to right is the development from a cube with a corner chopped off, which was to achieve, to comply with the daylight requirements for a building just on the north side. And it evolves into a building which in plan exhibits a diagonal symmetry from the southeast to the northwest corner, with a kind of prominent corner here, a flat that rotates through 180 degrees, and then three other flats which are mirrored about that diagonal axis. Then with these angled colonnades or loggias, orientated one in a way basically back to the centre of London, and the other picking up on the geometry of the 19th century city plan of de Beauvoir, but also the gentle crescent is planned around an octagonal stair, and you can see here the form of the building as it expresses that southeast corner, and then the plan. Particularly here, you'll notice that all the outside spaces are orientated away from the school courtyard. So what you're looking at here is a series of bedrooms. And so I guess just to finish on the facade, our ambition was in a way to not distinguish between bedrooms and living rooms, not distinguish between 1 and 2 bedroom flats. The scheme is essentially a mixture of 1 and 2 bedroom flats, but essentially to create a structure, to create a frame. We also explore this idea of kind of parity between inside and out, and drawing on in a quite kind of, naive reference to a familiar building, but how you make a composition out of a multi-story building, partly by breaking it into paired floors, but also by having very, very clear hierarchies between solid and transparent or hollow parts of the building. And that hollowness then translates into very clear rooms or thresholds that in the same way that there's a kind of ambition environmentally and socially for the school, there is a similar but different ambition for the housing. I suppose just that there is a room, there is something mediating between the room, which is in a way a room in itself, i.e. the loggia, and there's the city. And that has a dimension of theatre, but also a dimension of kind of privacy. And all of this in something which is robust and durable and designed to last for a long time. Thanks.
Okay, got a short moment for any questions. Anyone? Oh, there we go. There's somebody over there. Introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Catherine from RSHP. I wanted to know why it was important to maintain such a strict material palette for the facade. It's quite striking that you've gone for this matte terracotta finish between what illustrates balustrade and then your structure itself and your cladding. So what was the story behind that?
So brick was a kind of prerequisite. We didn't go through the history of the place or anything, but on the west side of this Kingsland Road, there's only 1 or 2 other public or civic buildings historically. There's a Metropolitan Hospital about 2 blocks away, and further down St. Columbus. which had this orange red brick material. On the opposite side, it had more of a Portland stone for any civic building. So that's where the red brick came from. And that, along with the precast idea of both structure and expression of the building, as Simon's already talked about, we investigated, of course, subtle differences, tonality, and actually what you see in the end is actually a red precast with red granite and red sand with an orange brick. But by a lot of investigation in testing in the mortar colours, what binds the two together, the precast colour binds the mortar. But that kind of homogeneous kind of character of the building has come together through a lot of experimentation. But in contrast to that redness, in that we're marking its civic place along this Kingsland Road, is completely contrasted by the school courtyard, by the ivory kind of fish scales, dappled light, neutral background, letting the kids in school become a kind of more neutral background and more light reflectant on the inside. So
I'll just add one thing about, not about the red, but about the homogeneousness. And one of the things, it's something that is fairly consistent in our work. And we find when we're using a very tight palette, where the colours are close, then what becomes really sort of draws your attention is those very subtle differences, the subtle differences in colour and texture. So, you know, the concrete next to the brick, next to the mortar, all those things. You know, it is a kind of recipe where those sort of marginal differences become heightened as opposed to huge contrast. Actually, all you just see is brick, timber, you know, as opposed to what kind of brick, what kind of mortar, what kind of concrete.
Have you seen it? Have you been past it? Questioner, no. So it might be worth visiting to see whether in the flesh it's
in the
stronger.
model, in the cast model, you can see clues. It's like a solid form that's carved out. So them being similar is very important to give it that weight and depth.
Any other questions? You haven't told us about the... Is there somebody with their hand up? Oh yeah, sorry.
Hello, I'm Chloe. I'm not an architect, so apologies if this is a silly
You don't
question.
have to apologise. Where are you from?
Where am I from?
What do you do?
I'm in comms, so yeah, nothing to do with architecture. But I'm just wondering if, like, how did you consider acoustics, considering it's like a school next to a housing? I imagine kids can be quite noisy. But also on the other side, like, if it specialises in music, was that something that came into account when you designed those, like, high-ceilinged rooms?
There might be a technical answer to the question, but I'm not necessarily going to give that. I mean, there are things, I think...
Noisy schools, I guess.
It is a noisy school, and when they're all out in the playground, it's noisy, and there's no getting around that. I mean, I guess the glazed brick and the brick surfaces and so on don't help. But having said that, there's a lot of form in the building. There's a lot of depth in reveals. There's a lot of canopies, and particularly between the housing and the school, there's that whole kind of datum of canopies over the upper story gallery, which contains the sound in the same way, in a way for the kids, it literally contains the space without enclosing it. There might be a technical answer though.
I mean, technically inside all the spaces are obviously designed, there's lots of exposed acoustic material, etc. You'll see in the hall, the kind of faceted diamond shape plan is to reverberate sound better, make all the music spaces acoustically perform better than just rectangles and boxes. But the fact that the facade that overlooks the school is twisted in a number of directions. They're dual aspect flats, they're on corners. You can choose, if you're home all day, like people have been in COVID, to close the windows in your bedroom, still have fresh air and be orientated away from the school. So there's just, you know, sensible orientation of the building and grouping of the flats help that. And of course, when it was designed pre-pandemic, there was an assumption that most people are away during the day. The timetables of school and living are perfectly kind of, you know, oscillate. So, but that hasn't been the case, and they're getting on fine.
And any more questions? I think we got. That's probably it. Anyone?
Tracy's half on the stage.
Yeah. Sorry. Let's go for the next shortlisted. Thank you.
Okay, so our last project before the interval, it's Sands End Arts and Community Centre by May Architects. This one is located in London again, in Fulham's South Park. And this project is a new community facility that incorporates an existing disused lodge, and as I understand it, is now much loved. Speaking on behalf of the project is Alex Ely from May Architects, and he will be joined by Kelly Bradley from Tideway for the Q&A, I believe. No, he will not be joined by Kelly Bradley from Tideway.
This is definitely the minnow in the pond this evening, the smallest project on the list. And as you can see, I'm going to build suspense with my choice of images. The pandemic has undoubtedly shone a spotlight on our need for social infrastructure. And social infrastructure creates the spaces that we need for face-to-face interactions that are really the building blocks of public life. And Sands End Community and Arts Centre is very much about exactly that, trying to build a community where interaction is sustainable and can grow and flourish. I said I was building my suspense with the imagery. So, a bit of context of who we are and who the client is. We were commissioned by Hammersmith and Fulham Council, really with a very strong vision from the leader of the council, Steve Cowan, to create a democratic building, really for the whole community, and also an exemplar low-carbon and circular economy building. And it was built without taxpayers' money. It was entirely funded by Tideway, who, as you know, are building a big sewer through London and have, as part of their sort of outreach program, are supporting community investment and have funded this. And then a really brilliant team of consultants that we've worked with. So I won't run through the list, but you can read them there. And it really is down to a strong collaboration, really, between all these players. So the setting, Hammersmith and Fulham is an area that is generally very affluent. It's seen as being affluent. The site, dotted in white, sits at this kind of knuckle between very wealthy housing to the north and the east, £4 million houses, probably more. And as you can see from this image, low-cost, affordable housing for those in need on the west. In fact, Hammersmith and Fulham has areas of huge deprivation, and Sands End Ward suffers significantly from that. In fact, it's in the top 30% of most deprived areas of England. Who'd have thought that? So, historically, back in the 19th century, the site was a private farmland. It was owned by Charlotte Sullivan. And she initially leased it out to Messrs. Vetch and Sons, who are renowned horticulturalists. They occupied it for a good number of years, until 1903, when the council negotiated with Charlotte Sullivan to take it on. It was gifted for use as a community park. And South Park, that the building sits in the corner of, is hugely popular. It's absolutely packed pretty much most days, even when it's raining, which is also most days. And it's got football pitches, tennis courts, the only cricket pitch in the area, and brilliant playgrounds as well. But there was a little corner of a site that was a maintenance yard for Hammersmith's Parks Department, so it was tarmacked area and effectively brownfield land. And as I mentioned, this area was initially Messrs. Vetch and Sons. They imported monkey puzzle trees, orchids, lots of rare species that we've now become familiar, but they were real pioneers in their time. But also, I suppose, just drawing on the history of the site, we were really taken to some of the sort of industrial, almost agricultural structures that might have existed on the site. They no longer exist. They weren't there when we started, but they gave us a sense of the sort of language that we could employ. And I suppose those very simple glass houses that are employed in horticulture are a model of kind of economy, really. And that's partly what we're trying to do in this building. The scheme was really developed through sketch models, and it's a building that sits between the city and the park, and it's trying to much as Simon's have explained in his scheme, trying to form that threshold between the urban condition and a different condition on the other side, in this case, a very rich landscaped, ecologically kind of diverse park. So, as Tracy mentioned, it includes retrofit. There's Clancarty Lodge, which, you know, we make no judgment about the architectural look of it, but it's locally listed, it was much loved, and it was deemed to have merit. So we incorporated that into the scheme. It has this very beautiful brick wall with terracotta detailing, which already had a gap in the fence for a gateway, so that's the threshold into the building. And the building creates these series of moments and transitions. From the street, you arrive in a small square. The landscape runs through to the entrance and then through to the park beyond. And then here you arrive in a small, intimate courtyard which opens onto where the cafe opens onto. Simple diagram. It's a small building. I've already said it's a minnow this evening. But very simply, you come into the main square, lobby, and then everything kind of branches off that. And the idea is that the building has a number of spaces that can operate independently, and it's flexible, so they can also work together. So the main hall can be used for lots of different uses that I'll come on to, but it has its own point of access. But equally, it can open up to the cafe, and so larger functions can take over. And then there's an annex, which originally was designed as a nursery, but actually then subsequently that was deemed unnecessary. So it's now being used by a local charity called Dance West to run dance classes and wheelbone classes for all age groups. But importantly, this brief was really developed with the community, and Hammersmith and Fulham have gifted it to the building to a trust. There's a really passionate and brilliant group of trustees who run the building, put an enormous amount of time and work with the staff in running it. So it's a properly sort of community-initiated project, community-developed project in the sense that they help shape the brief, and definitely community-run project. And then as we move interiors, it's a very simple series of very generous spaces where every space has a relationship to the landscape beyond. And it has simple volumetric mono-pitch roofs that give this generous interior inside. And I'm sure some of you will recognize that reference, which seems entirely appropriate for this evening. I won't give the clue away. You can ask me questions if you don't know it. So the plan is very simple. You come into a courtyard. The landscape runs through the entrance, and then you can either pinwheel off it into the event space, which has a screen that can open up to the cafe, or you can straight into the cafe, or you can just carry on through to the park. So dog walkers come and just go straight through the building, or we'll come back for a coffee. The old seed bank from when it was a maintenance yard, sorry, acoustics, weird there. Now there's a community gym in there. There are spaces that are used by local artists. And then Clancarty Lodge, as Tracy mentioned, is retained, and that's integral. So that creates a third side of this courtyard where the geometry just opens up gently to the bigger park beyond. And then this wing is ancillary spaces of toilets and showers. And then Dance West occupy this with the potential to have, or not potential, they have their own entrance here, or they can share the entrance through here. We worked with Elliott Wood on the engineering. It's entirely CLT superstructure, which delivers very low carbon performance and indeed sequesters carbon. It's also bolted, so bolted together rather than glued. So we're also thinking about the end of life of the building, so it can be dismantled and recycled. We've used made from waste products, in this case a made from waste brick, which uses crushed ceramics and sanitary ware, which would have otherwise gone to landfill. So we've kept 28 tons worth of material that might have or would have likely gone into landfill. So 35% of the building fabric is made from upcycled material. We've even turned the bricks on their side, so we use less of it. It's more economic, and you end up with quite an interesting, lovely kind of texture and proportion. And it's a low carbon building in its performance as well. So it naturally ventilates. There's deep shading on the south. There's vertical shading on the east and west. And there's natural cross ventilation. There's no mechanical ventilation. And then very rich in its landscape. And J&L Gibbons have reintroduced some of the species that Vetch and Sons were renowned for. But really ecology and landscape run through the building. So in the last 2 minutes I've got, 2 minutes and 11 seconds, according to my little timer down here, I'll just run you through the sequence of the building. So coming down Peterborough Road, we see Clancarty Lodge. So the wings of the pavilions of a new build, following that idea of a monopitch structure, so open up and reveal the Clancarty Lodge on the other side, and then you get a sense of the richness of the park beyond. And you get a clue of the main entrance. There are other entrances into the park, I should add. And then you see the gateway into the park. You see the main hall in front of you, which can have its own access. So if you wanted to use that for its own kind of purpose, that could have a direct access without needing to cross paths with those using the rest of the building. The vertical louvers, as I mentioned, providing solar shading for the low-angle evening sun. And then this lovely honey-coloured brick, which, interestingly, the site used to, it's so-called Sand's End, because they used to bag up the sand during the war for defences. So it's a kind of nice synergy there with, again, the history of the site. So you arrive in this wonderful little courtyard. The lampposts are kind of leaning into each other, towards each other, as if having a conversation. And you get a glimpse through from this entrance right through to the courtyard beyond. And already within a year, these gables are now covered in planting and foliage. This was photographed on completion, but I would much rather show it occupied now. We haven't subsequently gone back and photographed it. But you can see it's very pared back. There's no additional finishes, there's no plasterboarding, there's no architraves, there's no skirting. What you see is what you get. So we've minimized the materials to reduce the slabs, reduce the foundations, and really kind of minimize the resource being used in the building. And the CLT has this lovely green wash over it, which gives it a kind of haptic quality. Note the little gag there. This is the cafe, which again is now occupied by furniture and a kitchen. But again, you see the flexibility into the other rooms. And then looking back from the wonderful walnut grove, which was already established in the park, looking back to the cafe on the south side. Clancarty Lodge, as I mentioned, is done a light touch retrofit. We are demolishing a huge amount of buildings annually, and we need to look carefully at their potential reuse. And this is specifically used for art purposes now. So James Retief's photography, shown here on the right, was the most recent exhibition. And as you see from this photo, life has or rather ecology has taken over. So there's, and the life of the building has now taken over. And just to conclude, some of the users of this building range from Arcangelo, the most extraordinary Baroque chamber orchestra, international performing orchestra, are using it for not just local rehearsals, but open performances for local kids, school groups, and so on. There are bee and insect hotels, as well as other spaces for different species to enjoy the building. It's been used for Hammersmith's Climate Conference. It's been used by the local school for arts exhibits. This is Dance West with their kids' classes, as well as for others in later life. The Dementia Alliance use it for functions, as well as supporting outreach programs. This is Mary and Sandra, who run the cafe, and there are people having a nice cup of tea. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. What a lovely and inspiring project, and commissioned by a local authority and paid for by an infrastructure project. Isn't that heartening?
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Clearly a testament to how well used it is, the success of it. So yeah, questions. Have we got any questions from the floor? Don't be shy. Yes, we have some. Can you introduce yourself? Please don't be from RSHP.
Hi, I'm Sally. I'm from Glen Howells Architects. You said the building or the brief was largely shaped by the community and they were quite involved in it. So can you tell us a bit about the process of how they were quite involved and how you got to the brief?
Yeah, huge amount of engagement during the process. So there was already a group of very keen residents who had already articulated the needs of the community to the leader of a council. So it wasn't the leader of a council just coming up with an idea that he wanted to create this new community facility. In the first instance, there were some community groups, and there were Tim Prager leading the sort of championing the cause for a new community building. A number of those subsequently became the trustees. So they were already vocal about what they needed. But actually, in order to try and really define the brief, we then needed open workshops, open engagement evenings, reaching out through Hammersmith and Fulham to some of the likely end users of the building, and we were able to work with them to really understand how they might potentially use it. So that was really in the run-up to planning, having exhibitions, but also not just kind of presenting, but actually sitting down around a table and trying to understand their needs. So it had to be designed flexibly, and it still remains flexibly. Some of the uses are still unknown, although, as you can see from the last slide, that there is a huge variety of users. And I guess it will evolve, and I hope it does.
By the sounds of things, it's already evolving. The fact that the nursery turned out not to be needed and Dance West have now sort of created a base there.
Yeah, so they're really happy with their permanent home. They used to be the Lyric in Hammersmith, but it really suits their needs. And they've got their own space, but then if they have bigger classes, they can use the main hall. Again, it's really ideal in terms of the sort of local need and interest.
Great. I think there was another question in the same row. Oh, if not, there's a question down here.
That was really great, thank you. Did your key reference for the school by any chance share a name with a certain prize that we're here to celebrate?
Maybe. Like Simon, Stirling is a hero of ours. And yeah, it's the Brunswick Primary School. But it's a very simple structure that it isn't, it's a leaning beam on a strut. And it kind of lent itself, Andy can probably tell us more about the thinking, I can see he's in row 3, about the engineering. But, we'd already settled on a mono-pitched space. And in fact, the smaller spaces are literally a beam leaning between two walls. But it's only the larger space that needs that strut that then sort of borrows shamelessly from Big Jim.
Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, so our next shortlisted architects are Reiach and Hall. Like Hopkins and Niall McLaughlin, they've been shortlisted 4 times. So, come on up, Neil Gillespie.
I'll stand on this side. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Right. Forth Valley College, Falkirk campus. Obviously, when I speak to you, I'm speaking on behalf of a big team back at Reiach and Hall, a great team, and also a full design team. And the project was a single-stage design build. I won't get into too much detail about design build, but I will if you want me to. But a great delivery team, Kepi, KG Tate. But also, I'd just like to say a big thanks to our client, Forth Valley College, a fantastic client, and hopefully that may come over as we go through. I'd also like to start by putting a little bit of context and also exercising a few ghosts, not quite James Stirling, but almost. Reiach and Hall was formed in 1965, 2 practices who'd been around in the 1940s, so it's got a long gestation, shall we put it that way. 1962, this is projects that the practice did for Edinburgh University. And what's obviously about that context is that we've always had an eye on the north. Scandinavia, that has always been a really strong influence, not only for our practice, but for the whole architectural culture of a certain period within Scotland, within the colleges. And that kind of reference was really concerned with, I would call it soft modernism, if you like, a concern for material, concern for light, concern for simplicity. And primary among the architects who were influential was Arne Jacobsen, particularly for his elegance and almost his austerity of approach really appealed then, and it still appeals now. And I'm going to make I can drop this now, I can make a wee book. I haven't written the book, but there's a lovely book that's just been translated in English called Eloquent Silences, Writings on Art and Architecture by Carlos Martí Ares. Okay, and there's a few essays on Jacobsen. And there's just a couple of phrases, and I'm only going to read one because I know the counter's going down already, is that speaking about Jacobsen, Martí Ares says, these are constructions where the work put in has erased its own traces, hence their levity and their lack of drama. He goes on to say why Jacobsen is a significant architect. And so this sense of elegance, this sense of material, and also this sense of landscape. And I just wanted to reference a couple of our projects that, because all of us are sitting within not only our cultural context of our practice, but also in the cultural context of our previous work. And this was a project, Maggie's Lanarkshire, which introduced some themes which you'll see in the Forth Valley College. This idea of material as a primary idea within the building, this idea of modesty, and courtyards. And this courtyard, we introduced what we called light catchers, which were elements that would interfere with light as it came into a courtyard. And notice the triangle. Another building which was really instrumental was the National Nuclear Archive in Wick, in Caithness. If anybody knows Caithness, it's called the flow country because it's mostly water. Dig a hole, it fills up with water. So there's this idea of building on water, and the idea of courtyards coming through the project, and the idea of horizontal and horizon. So we move on to Falkirk, and Falkirk is situated in the Forth Estuary, hence Forth Valley College services the Forth Valley. And these are images of the estuary from a few years ago, 1954 on the left and fairly recently on the right. And the estuary at this point is called Skin Flats, which is it's not an attractive name, I don't think, Skin Flats. But it's actually derived from German Dutch meaning Schoenplatz, handsome land. And what this is telling us is that this area of Scotland was very much connected to the Low Countries, to Scandinavia, but primarily to the Netherlands and to those countries. The other thing that's really critical about this image is this, which was the Long Annet power station, now gone. But the Forth Valley has always been a place of industry. So industry, horizon, mud. That's what we need to remember. And the idea of the North Sea, not as a negative thing, but as a positive thing, something which connects Scotland, particularly to the Low Countries and to Denmark. And this circle here illustrates an idea that we had about making a material connection with Scandinavia, with Jacobsen, so culture and trade, but also material and making. And the circle on the right is Peterson bricks, and I'm sure we all know Peterson bricks, beautiful brick. And this idea of that translating clay into a material that we could then use in architecture, and the idea of making. And I'll refer back to design build. We were longing to make something, whereas design build is normally about assembling things. So here we are, Forth Valley College to the north is the Ochil Hills. And this is the Forth Estuary. There's the mud. So that's Skin Flats here. Here, Falkirk. And the college was an amalgamation of two big colleges, Falkirk College and Clackmannan College, to form a super college based in 3 locations. And so we've been working with the college for over 15 years on these 3 campuses. Alloa was the first, finished in 2011 as a business campus. views from the library to the Ochil Hills. Stirling is creative arts and hospitality on a bend in the Forth, one of these amazing bends. This idea of creating a platform from which to look out on the landscape, and then the Scandinavian site, dialect. So we come to Falkirk. Should I be moving around? Should I loitering here? Here's the site. It's on the edge of Falkirk, Falkirk town centre, and there is a green route proposed to connect the college to the centre of Falkirk. But at this point here, the campus also connects to a park, the Helix Park, and the infamous Kelpies, I'll say nothing about them, up to the Skin Flats, and that's the canal coming in here. So there was a really interesting shift in alignment between this route and north. And just looking back through sketchbooks round about that time, you can see that this was the nuclear archive. And this was ideas for Falkirk, where we look to create a kind of orthogonal plan which relates to the context. So in terms of NDA, it was to do with field pattern. In terms of Falkirk, it was the road into Falkirk. And then there's this alignment with north. And you'll see that coming up in the plan. So we're interested in an immediate context, but we're interested in a bigger idea of where we are in the world. And so this is a site plan, so you'll see north there, and you'll see the figure ground of the three main buildings, the main teaching block, the workshops, sport. And you'll start to see how the north starts to interfere with the courtyards. And I'll go through this very quickly. So there's the green route running east-west back into Falkirk over here. Grangemouth Road coming in here. And Falkirk College itself. Now this campus services STEM primarily. So science, technology, engineering and maths. And it's really serving companies like BP at Grangemouth, these kind of things. And from the north, this is a staff and student car parking. They arrive at this entrance. Visitor parking here, arrive at this entrance. Service yard, service from here. So there's our floor plan. It's two-story predominantly. This is the main teaching building on the left, but I'll go through these very quickly. So two main entrances, three courtyards, influenced by that northern alignment. An east-west concourse, which, as I'll explain, connects all of the facilities within the college that the public can use. So it's a building that tries to bring the community in. So they align themselves along this route and face the main road into Falkirk. And then a north-south route coming from the car park straight through. And this is really where the interface between staff, who are over here, general teaching here, through to specialists this way. And then along this route, we have these kind of nodal points where the circulation expands and makes a connection through to the courtyard. So the courtyard always has an influence on these moments within the circulation route. And along these, the main route is where all the cores are. So you start to get this kind of sense of swelling, sense of connection with the outside, but it's also where all the toilets and services are. So a very simple diagram. And then from these nodes, circulation works east-west through the building. So that was the kind of backbone of the building. The public entrance, and this is the flexible community room. This is the general teaching space. That's the workshops. Hopefully get through this soon. I won't say too much on this, but we developed over the three colleges a generic section which was to do with thermal mass, heat recovery, natural ventilation, etc. But I could go into some more detail. But also the section is quite revealing in that the building sits on 40 meters of mud because it's on skin flat. So we have a series of thermal piles which connect this thin crust to the bedrock below. And we've used these as energy piles, so we're cooling and heating through an exchanger and using the piles for that. And we're also, the other thing I wanted to introduce here was the gold roof lights, which is reference back to Maggie's. So there's from the Falkirk Road, this idea of the horizontal, but also this idea of movement. And these are the community spaces, sports spaces. The idea that you might, like Jacobson, you might just fall into this building. There's no sense of difficulty in crossing that threshold. We're really trying to make this a really accessible place, because it's primarily about trying to get young people who have maybe not had a great time at school to understand that there's another kind of institution that can give them a real start. Not just young people, older people, changing course. Landscape by Horner McLennan, I think, is very beautiful at certain times of the year. And I'll just go through these very quickly. We've got the Peterson brick on the main block, and then an extruded aluminium on the workshops. Courtyards. Courtyards probably our most disappointing aspect at the moment. Client won't let us put trees in, but we've got a new principle, and we're hoping to revisit those in landscape terms. The idea of a surface that's drawn to try and give it a scale that operates across precast concrete, aluminium, Velcromat, suspended ceilings of timber through to manifestation on the glass. So it's filled with young people. I'm running out of time now, aren't I? I'll just go through this. Main concourse, reception, library resource spaces, the golden. I'm just going to go through these. Resource, this is the library. So that we did a little trick, which I shouldn't really admit to, is that in the staff areas, we designed it to the net space rather than the gross space. So we took the balance space out of the staff area and designed it very tightly and put that space we gained into the circulation spaces, because these don't meet Scottish Future Trust metrics in terms of generosity. I'll just run through. These are some of the node points as we go up the main north-south. Dining. And it's filled with young folk doing this. Beauty, sport, workshops. This is part of the engineering workshops. Welding, bricklaying. And they're serving all the industries, local industries. New renewables section, plumbing, machine engineering, joinery, distillation. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Can you explain why you're not meant to tell us that clever move of turning net internal, gross internal,
because
get us the extra space?
I suppose if we could then design to the lower area, we would lose that area in the future.
In the future.
Yeah.
So if you're funder.
I mean, I think if you walk through the staff areas, you wouldn't be aware that that area had been taken out. And of course, now that COVID, there's a change in working practices anyway. So in many ways, it's a sensible. It was a sensible thing to do. Mm-hmm. So it may well be those metrics will be revisited. I'm not sure.
All right. Questions? Anyone? Hand up, roughly the middle. Can you introduce yourself? You sound like you don't need a mic. This is great. But just. All right.
You mentioned about the courtyard and how you're going to readdress the space. How would you reimagine the space now?
I think the client was very nervous about internal courtyards and maintenance. Simple as that. About drains and blockage and things like that. The principal who's been with us on most of the last part of the journey is a guy called Ken Thompson, who's an amazing guy. And he, by training, was a zoologist and ecologist. And I think there's an avenue there that could be explored in terms of those those courtyards in terms of some of the courses that they run. I mean, these FE colleges are training all the jobs that you can't imagine, like countryside rangers and, you know, travel agents and all this sort of thing. So we think that there could be a really good ecological story about the 3 courtyards. The issue with Falkirk and Skin Flats is it's very open, and therefore landscape does struggle to get a grip. But the courtyards, of course, are protected. Therefore, we think that they've got a really great opportunity to do something much more lush, much more variated. And at the same time, the students can then use the courtyard. So that's our hope, anyway.
One area didn't, I might have missed it, but a number of projects I visited when I ran around for the RAS up there were similar to yours, and that front foyer is open to the public. So people are using the hairdressers, the local community is using the hairdressers, using the foyers as part of some public space. Is this something that architects are instigating, or is it necessary? All right, so okay.
I think a number of our projects have been college projects, and the wonderful thing about a college as opposed to a university is that the college are very, very, very interested in placing people in employment. And part of the interesting aspect about a college is that they're trying to reenact industry standard places of work. Mm-hmm. So as young folk learning to be beauticians or hairdressers, they need to cut hair. Not my hair, but my nails are wonderful. So they're practicing on the public. And as you know, the Forth Valley College is open to the public to go and eat there, and to have a coffee, and to use it as a public interface through the day. So that's really what it's about. It's about young people, employment, and giving them a start.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be other questions. Is there anybody else? Or maybe at the end, okay? Right, next.
Okay, next up we have Orchard Gardens Elephant Park by Panter Hudspith Architects. By contrast to the Minnow we saw before the break, this is a huge project. 228 homes and 2,500 square metres of retail and cultural spaces. Orchard Gardens is an entire city block and a huge component of the Elephant and Castle regeneration project. Speaking on behalf of the project is Simon Hudspith from Panter Hudspith Architects, and he will be joined in the question and answer session by Niall Matthews from Gillespie's Landscape. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know, but I'm presuming that most people know, Elephant Park is a very, very important regen project near the Elephant Castle in South London. It was previously the Haygate estate, which attracted an enormous amount of controversy when a decision by Southwark Council was made in 2004 to redevelop that estate. Our client for the project was Lend-Lease, who came some 6 years after Southwark Council decided to make that decision. And unfortunately, there isn't anyone from Lend-Lease who can be here tonight to talk about their role in the project. So I'll say something on their behalf, if I can get out of this sunshine. There were 2 members of the development team, Tom Branton and Ed Mays, who were extremely supportive of the ideas that we developed during the planning process. And without those 2 people, we would not have been able to do what we've done. And we would not have been able to design the building or the group of buildings that I'm about to show you. So, however, I think what's important in relation to telling the story about the building is its context and where it's come from. And this particular building or group of buildings has a long history. It sort of started over 100 years ago. And this is the Walworth Road
in about 1914. It could be slightly later, it could be slightly earlier. But this is a commercial high street which could be any one of 100 streets coming out of the centre of London. However, this one is coming from the Elephant Castle or from South London on the way to Brighton. And yet, within it is a record of people, businesses, activities, life, community, families, which were a key part of what made the Walworth Road and what made it as a place. 60 years later, this is a landscape plan of the Haygate estate. And what's important is this note at the bottom. And it talks about the need for semi-mature trees and how important they would be in terms of defining or enhancing the character of the Haygate estate. And those trees, in terms of the history of the place, become more and more and more important as time moves on. And in a way, you can see why the trees became so important, because this was also 1974, or a little bit before. And you can see that this whole notion of mass production housing and what's involved in making very large volumes of homes very quickly obviously has a key component of that is this notion of repetition and mass production. And so the trees, in a way, became a really important part of how you would try and make a community that people would associate with, feel part of, make it their home. This also is 1974. And in a way, the shop fronts and the roofscapes are pretty much as they were 70 years earlier. But as you can see, just in here, there's a new member of the roofscape, which is trying to establish itself within a community, but obviously very, very different from what the existing character was. In 2004, as I said, Southwark decided that they needed to demolish the Haygate estate and redevelop it. Amid enormous controversy, quite rightly, in terms of a community who'd had spent 30 years trying to establish itself, trying to become part of what the Walworth community was, were then told, oh, well, you've all got to move out because we're going to build a new community. But that was a decision that was made. And it sort of raised a whole series of issues about how we made those sorts of buildings in the 60s and 70s. And also, certainly from our point of view, it raised a really important question about modernism and its sort of shunning of this need for identity, this need for people to feel as if they belong somewhere, that they can point to something and say, that's where I live. So we won a competition in end of 2013, beginning of 2014. And this was one of the first drawings that I looked at. And this is an incredible piece of work by Diana Cochrane, who recorded the buildings on the Walworth Road. And what I found fascinating about this is how it's so obvious that it's a group of buildings that have been built and appeared over time. And it sort of defined or it represents this community of people and how they live. And this group in particular, there are 7 buildings, and they are done by individuals, by businesses, by people who feel as if they want to make something or make a contribution to the community. And so we used this as a starting point. And because in a way, this vernacular it's not designed by architects. It's designed by local people who have a feeling about place. And so we used this as a starting point. And this is something which exists throughout Europe. And you can go into any historic city, and the same principle applies. You have a very simple vernacular which then people then vary and make their own over time. Similarly in Holland, the palette of materials is much more restrained, but it's the same principle. So what we did is we established a contemporary vernacular, a vernacular that we thought was appropriate for a group of buildings that would have differences within it. It could be expressed in very simple ways or more complex ways. It would have a mixture of brick, different types of windows, and those would change depending on what the circumstances were for each of the buildings. There were 4 key blocks within our scheme, and they were designed by 4 people: Larissa, Alison, Emma, and Tim. Angus and Luca came along a bit later, but each architect went off and designed their own block within this contemporary vernacular. And on a Friday afternoon, they would bring their buildings into the meeting room, and it was my job then to try and calibrate or balance each of their designs to put it in context together. So the principle of this building is primarily the ground floor is for public use. It's for shops, restaurants, community use, some cultural. The upper floors are about homes, and it's nothing particularly special in terms of how they've been put together, but that mix of those 2 uses together begins to sort of set a vitality and begins to establish a life for the place. And so we finished in 2018, or the end of 2018. COVID then came, and the ground floor sat empty for 2.5 years. However, Southwark Council came along, and they took 2 shops and used those as a community library and a community museum, which established the sort of ground floor use. We also, if I can just go back, established this notion of colonnades and the importance of colonnades in terms of how they help to create public spaces. So this is the model, and you can see from here we have buildings of 5 and 6 stories which front onto the Walworth Road and also front onto the Walworth Square. The 2 colonnades establish a sort of public route along the Walworth Road and into the Walworth Square, which in turn then goes up to, creates this new route to the Elephant and Castle railway station. And then the forms of the building gradually increase as you move around the scheme. So this is the view that you get from the Walworth Road. You can see we have a series of smaller townhouse buildings that front onto the square. This is the view looking into Walworth Square. The building on the left, in a sense, balances the library the existing town hall on the other side of the Walworth Square, and then creates this route through to Sayer Street and up to the railway station, Elephant and Castle. And the other thing that was very important is, in a sense, using the buildings on the square to, in a way, screen the taller buildings that were happening behind. So as you can see here on them, you're using the foreground buildings, in a sense, to create a sense of place, and then the maisonettes that we've got up on the upper levels then become part of that composition, and then the taller buildings, which are 30 metres away and 20 metres wider, become part of the character of what that roofscape is. Then as you move around into Walworth Square, then each of the townhouses begins to take its own or create its own identity and change, so that even though the flats are all the same in plan, the elevations are unique. So people can say, you know, I live with the one with a funny chamfered window with the brown brick, and my neighbour has a straight window with red brick. And that richness we felt was very, very important in terms of establishing this character or this notion that these buildings could have been built over time. And this is then looking back onto the Walworth Square. And obviously the landscaping, which Niall will talk about in a minute, it was a very, very important part of how the square developed. Gillespie's did an amazing job of getting the amount of plants they did in such a small space. Then moving up onto into Sayer Street and up towards the Elephant Castle railway station, the question was then how we take buildings that are essentially 6 stories and express them as 12 stories. And we used 3 tools really: physical models, computer electronic models, and then CGIs. And so we were playing or using all of those 3 all at the same time in terms of understanding the balance of each of the components. And so this was a very important moment in terms of us making the leap of understanding or going from 6 to 12 stories, that we could keep the same language, you keep the same house types, but you just put another floor on. And then the importance of the trees that were planted in 1974, the semi-mature planes, then became a really important part of the landscape. And I'm now massively running over time, so I'm quickly going to go through the last couple of bits. The podium courtyard, which everybody has access to. So all of the 4 blocks, whether they're affordable or private or shared ownership, all have access to this garden. This was planted within the first 6 months of the building being finished. And then, as you can see, once it got established, then the greenery really took off in terms of making this place, this shared garden at first floor level. And finally, the tower, or the tall building, which was 18 stories high, which we'd never done a building this high before. But what we felt we had to do was apply the same principles of splitting it into a series of buildings. And we did this by expressing each of the flats on each of the 4 corners, and then we shifted the plan so that the 1-beds became dual aspect. So all of the flats were dual aspect on the tower. We integrated the balconies into the plan so they become part of the living space, and we made the language of the balconies become part of the elevations, or the internal elevations of the room. So they're very, very much part of how people live within their flats. And finally, the language of the tower, having made the decision that we could take a 6-story townhouse and double it to get 12 stories, it was a fairly easy decision to go from 12 stories to 18 stories, which is what we did. And these are some of the drawings that we did in terms of exploring that. And so finally, we have, in a sense, a tower block or an 18-story tower, which is a standalone building in one sense. In another sense, it came out of the history of the Walworth Road and the character of those buildings and what they stood for, so that it has a much stronger relationship to that existing community. Thank you. Sorry I ran over.
Thank you. So we're joined by Niall from Gillespie's. So I don't know if there's some questions from the audience. I mean, what strikes me is the way that it seems so much of its place, despite the fact that so much of its place has been destroyed. And that's really quite an achievement to have managed to keep that kind of connection back into the history of the place. So do we have any questions in the audience? Seeing as we've got Niall here, it'd be good to have a landscape question. Oh, we have one at the back there.
My name's Elliot. I'm from Reiach Architects. It's not one about landscape, but I really enjoyed the narrative, but I'm intrigued as to why you've chosen to present the project by only showing one image of the interior with a project that is for over 200 homes. I think it's a lovely piece of the city, but I didn't get a sense of it being 200 odd homes.
Well, that's a perfectly valid question. I mean, the reason I didn't do it is because of time. And
12 minutes.
In a way, the important thing about the project, I suppose it's a given that the quality of the flats should be exemplar, and you know, I can say that, but they're very, very good flats. But to me, it was important in a way to position the project in two ways. The first one is the history that it's come from in terms of how it relates to the Walworth Road and what the tradition was of the Walworth Road in terms of the types of materials, in the sense that it's an everyday building. It's not high architecture. It's just brick and window linings, as the buildings are on the Walworth Road. And so I felt it was important that people should understand that relationship. The second point is this notion of identity and the fact that we were trying to make these flats homes and allowing and creating an identity that allowed people to relate to them. So they're not grid F21 on the 14th floor. They're the person who lives in that funny or next to that funny balcony. And I felt that was a very important part of what the project's about. And equally, it's also a very important part of the support we got from Lend-Lease, who went along with that and bought into it, even though it made it more expensive, even though it made it more difficult to build.
Great, thank you. I think we need to move on. So, Niall, having got you up here, what we'll do is we'll get you back up for the questions. There's going to be, I think, Amin mentioned a Q&A session at the end, so that will be your opportunity to ask your questions, because I think we need to move on. So okay. I will thank you very much, Stephen and Niall, and move back to Amin.
Well done. Okay, on our last on the shortlist, Niall McLaughlin Architects, also shortlisted 4 times, are going to be presenting. This is Tim, Alan Booth, and Claire McMenamin. That's got partly my name in it, so I should be able to pronounce. Okay. New Library, Magdalene College.
So we were appointed in 2014 by Magdalene College to design a new library, gallery and archive for them. This would in turn allow for the redevelopment or the reuse of the Pepys building, which housed the library previously, to make it more accessible and to make the Pepys collection open to the public. So this map from the 1500s shows that while most of the colleges in Cambridge were located in the city centre, Magdalene was actually located on the periphery. Try and point. It's here to the north of the River Cam. And while it was established initially as a monastery for Benedictine monks, it's now had a history of 550 years of academic study on the site. So these buildings in this drawing from the 1600s are still in use by the college today. So we can follow the route to our library site. So we enter through a little archway from Magdalene Street into First Court, which is fully enclosed with brick buildings. Then we pass through a second archway into the more open Second Court. And here we meet the stone facade of the Pepys building, which had been the college library. We then pass through this little gateway beside the Pepys building to arrive at our site. Our site is in the Fellows Garden, which at the time of this drawing was a formal garden on the edge of the River Cam. And the way that the buildings of the college have been built to stand the test of time in this way was a really important precedent for our building. We wanted to add to this tradition. And the Fellows Garden now is more of an informal garden with lots of mature trees. And the elevations of the Pepys building, which face the garden and face our site, is very different to the stone facade that faces Second Court. It's a brick building with simple window openings. And the site, although appears quite open, had quite a lot of constraints. So much of the Fellows Garden is within the floodplain of the River Cam. There's a lot of mature trees that we wanted to retain. There's a pet cemetery to the north, and there's a listed garden wall to the west. This resulted in a compact 3-story building to the edge of the garden with views looking east, and the main entrance to the library, main entrance to the library facing onto the edge of the Pepys building, extending the quadrangular arrangement of the college.
Thanks, Claire. So legend has it that Magdalene College was built on the far side of the Cam to keep the monks who lived there away from the temptations of the town. The brief for the library said that the college wanted a place in which students would be able to set aside kind of worldly distractions and home life and focus on their study. And these two ideas, the kind of the monks of Magdalene and the brief, put us in mind of this painting by the Renaissance artist Antonello de Messina. And it's a painting of St. Jerome in his study. And what we loved about this painting is the way in which, first of all, the scholar, with his book open in his hands, is in the center of the image. It's the center of the world that's created here. And the monk is sitting on this strange piece of furniture that's both a desk, a bookshelf, and a kind of raised platform. And this construction sits within this spacious hall that has both views out, light coming in, and the view of a rural or parkland landscape beyond. And then the image itself is held within this kind of masonry frame. And so this image became a kind of touchstone for this project. We began our design at the sort of micro scale, looking at the size that a desk needed to be. This is some tests of how much space you need for your laptop and your book on Adolf Loos. And then we aggregated these into shared reading tables. The college wanted a mixture of shared reading tables and individual desks. So we began with a reading table for 6 people in the center of a semi-enclosed room, a room enclosed by bookshelves, so that you would always feel within the library amongst books. And this room, a good dimension for this room was 4.7 meters in both directions, and this became the kind of basic building block of our plan. And then we started to think about ways in which we would combine that basic building block into a bigger plan. And what we wanted to do was to keep the kind of cellular kind of quality of that individual room legible within the plan form. And so we look at Hertzberger's Central Bahia and these 2 projects by Luke Hahn, the Trenton Bath House and the Richards Medical Research Laboratory. And what we loved about these projects was the legibility of the parts and also the way in which they used this, what we called a tartan grid, which has a major and a minor interval within it. And so this is our grid as a diagram, grid for the building. The beige squares are our reading rooms. Surrounding those is a grey zone, which is the depth of a double-sided bookcase. There's also room for vertical servicing and external walls. And then between these square spaces are separated by passageways, which are the white spaces, and they run in 2 directions. And where they cross, you get a little green space, which is a bit broader than the passageway, and it makes a passing place for the circulation. And at the corners of that space, there's 4 L-shaped columns to take the load of the library down through the building. And what we realized immediately about this section is that it has a landlocked bit in the middle. And we thought about this amazing project by Sohn and also his Bank of England project, and the way he brings light down through the roof into the depths of the building and creates an amazing atmosphere. And we love the richness of this section and tried to emulate that. And so we placed roof lanterns above each of our square bays. They're formed of 2 pitched roofs crossing at right angles. They have 4 glazed triangular gables, one on each side. And these lanterns are spaced apart by the width of our passageways so that they bring light down into the plan. And at the same time that we're wondering about how bringing light down into the plan, our engineers are worrying about how we're going to get the hot air out of the top. And they suggested that we might have some form of flue at roof level to let the hot air out, and we came up with this idea of chimneys, and using chimneys to exhaust the hot air, using its natural buoyancy. So the air for the building, the whole building is naturally ventilated, the air is drawn in through the facades and then exhausted through the roof. And we placed the chimneys above those passing places on that grid, those green nodes. And so the structure of the building rises up through it, taking up the loads of the floors, and then becomes a brick chimney above eaves level. And that gives us this kind of roofscape of folded lanterns, which are sort of pinned in place by this array of brick chimneys. This is the ground floor. You enter in the middle on the south side, which is on the left in this drawing. Ahead of you is the archive facility. There's an archive storeroom and a research space. And at the bottom of the page is a long gallery space which opens up to the Fellows' Garden. And you can see on this plan that there's a very small part of the plan, which are these 2 bays up here, which is actually library on this floor. And so this led to a long conversation with the college about how we connect those 2 little particles of the library with the rest of it, which is on the upper 2 floors. And we came up with this idea of a diagonal route that takes you up through the building, up towards the light and up towards the view of the garden and the river. And on the way, you pass through 3 spaces. The bottom one is 3-story with the entrance, and then you step up a floor, and the second one is 2-story, and finally you're in a single-story space looking out towards the view. And so you see this in the section of the building. This is the second floor plan. When it came to the plan, we kind of inverted that arrangement. So the 3-story space is 1 bay on plan, and then the central reading room, the 2-story one at first floor level, is 2 bays, and our top floor single-story room is 3 bays, and is long and enjoys the long elevation out towards the garden. So here we are beginning in the 3-story space. There's a square reading table at the base of that room, and then the upper floors, the floor edges are lined with desks which overlook the space. And you come up a stair off the corner of that space and you arrive at the north end of this long 2-story reading room with a long reading table down its center. And then you move across that space and go up another stair and you arrive at the end of this room. And now you're sort of in the attic below the roof lights with the view out towards the garden. So while we're kind of enjoying how we lay out the library inside, the college is getting quite concerned about how this building, which is covered in chimneys, is going to look from the outside, and they think we maybe are about to produce a factory for them. So we showed them these images of English country houses, and we said, you can find all of the elements that you see in these images in your college buildings. There are gables with pitched roofs, there are chimneys, there are projecting bays. And what we want to do for your building is to kind of use these elements, which you would find familiar, but make something modern out of them. And we particularly like this image at the top of Moynes Hall in Essex, which has a kind of rhythm coming from the assemblage of the parts. And so this is our version on the west facade. And the kind of the plan arrangement gives us more solid bits of accommodation in the corners with less fenestration. And then the middle of each of the principal facades, we get a big bay window, or series of bay windows, which kind of centers each of the 3 main facades on the space that it faces toward. And these bays, the design is derived from the internal arrangement. So at first floor level, we get a small enclosed room with 2 timber opening shutters flanking a central fixed window. And then at the upper level, In the bigger room, you get a wider bay with a fixed desk built into that bay. And this is how they look on the outside, borrowing heavily again from Lucan.
So the building's primarily constructed of two materials, brick and timber. On the exterior, the brick relates to the existing college buildings. And on the interior, there's a warp and weft of different timber elements that sit between brick piers. We wanted it to feel very crafted and intuitive, so you see all of the exposed structure and most of the surfaces that you can touch are the brick and the timber. The existing college buildings have really rich tapestries of brickwork, and repair work over centuries have increased that further. The building on the right here, the Pepys building, has a mix of like brown and red and purple bricks. And we worked very closely with the builder or main contractor, Coxedge, and the subcontractors and York Handmade to develop a mix of the different colours and textures that would work well beside the existing buildings. And because they were, we used the kind of timber moulds and they were thrown by hand, there was quite a nice texture on the surface of the bricks. And we used a smaller brick than a standard modern brick and a larger mortar joint. And the mortar joint is flush and it's got exposed aggregate to try and soften the texture. And all of the kind of main vertical structure is low-bearing brick. So the external wall is, the inner and outer leaf of the cavity wall is brick, and these brick piers rise through the building. And they're a main part of the structure. We were very keen to not have any cut bricks, so there was the list of specials grew, and in the end up we had sort of one brick for every letter of the alphabet, and when they turned up on site, they had their names imprinted onto the bricks, which was quite nice. And in some ways the building is a very traditional way of building, but in other ways it's highly engineered. And collaboration between people with a wide range of skills was necessary to make this possible. And it was a design and build project, and I think from both sides of it was very enjoyable. And the client, the engineers, the contractor who worked on it were all really dedicated to making a building that was of really high quality. And when we reached this point at reaching the top of the first chimneys, it was a real moment of celebration for the whole team. The horizontal structure is CLT and glulam, and the timber came from Switzerland, and we've been told that in the forest where it's grown, if you equate how much is grown per year, the structural timber for the project could be regrown in just under 8 minutes, but it took a lot longer to draw. And we worked very closely with Smith & Millwork on the timber structure, and reflecting the sort of repetitive grid of the plan. The beams sort of continue along the passageways and then cross at the node points. Where they cross, they form timber hashtags at these node points, and they rest on precast lintels, which are then built into the brick piers, which rise continuously through the building to support the ventilation chimneys. And the lanterns which bring the light deep into the building were made from CLT. They were assembled on the ground beside the building, and then they were lifted into place. And internally then the bookcases, the desks, the doors and the windows are all made from European oak, and they now sit between the brick piers in a sort of similar way to the painting of St. Jerome, where the desk sits between the piers. And it's been very nice just to see all of the students come back in and be able to study alongside one another again after a difficult few years for them. So thank you.
speaking for our own practice, we learn with every project. You know, you discover something you're definitely going to use elsewhere, and you also discover lots that you don't want to use again. I'm intrigued and fascinated, and what other word can I use? Proud to see the sort of assemblage of materials there. But the question I have, and I think I know the answer because it's pretty much the same question to a lot of you. Brick. Everyone's choosing brick, and often the stock answer is, well, conservation area, and we've done it. It's a conservation area, it's a given. We had to do it. Is there an answer? I mean, I'll let you answer, and then I've got another question after that. And hopefully by that stage somebody else has... I can hear you.
Is the question why brick?
Yes, why brick? And if someone's telling you we need that scale of material, that mimicking of what's in that context for you to be able to get across the hurdle of planning, I'm also intrigued who your clients are, because they struggle with the idea of this little beef, and immediately we recognise as trained architects what we're looking at, but they're struggling with your first models and images, thinking it's going to look like a factory. So who is driving this desire for brick? I mean, Hopkins escape. Well, they escaped with on this particular building with that question.
I mean, I think you can say in this project, well, the college is mainly made of brick. Well, the Pepys building that we saw has a stone front, but that's the only bit. It's a bit of an oddity. But I think for this project, actually, the interesting thing about brick for us was this idea of stacking up the building. So you make these kind of piles of bricks, and then every so often you put a timber beam across, and then you carry on. And actually, it's a nightmare to build, because as you go, the brick takes ages to go off. You have to bring it all up, then you put the CLT on. It all gets wet whilst you build the next floor. It's very tricky.
Yeah.
So it was amazing that the contractor stuck with it. We had a contractor at the tender stage who said, can you not just build it all out of CLT and clad it with brick? You're not getting it, are you?
Yeah.
So that, I think for us it was partly about that process of stacking up the structure and making that visible that made us want to use bricks.
Okay.
Yes. Well, the other thing about brick is, I mean, okay, there's a lot of energy goes into making the brick, which is probably what underscores your question. But if you use it with a lime mortar, you clear the brick, you can clean it and reuse it. So it's a one-off investment of energy. So that's why we use it an awful lot with lime mortar too.
There is lime in the mortar.
Okay, the key thing about lime mortar is that it takes a while to go off, doesn't it? You stack too many bricks up and it begins to squeeze the lime mortar out. So yeah, you have to wait a while, which is why a lot of contractors say, well, fine, I'll just be on site that much longer. I guess the question I'm asking is that, you know, and please, you know, we're the RIBA, just architects amongst us. This is an opportunity for a bit of debate, a bit of learning for all of us. What we've stumbled across, I guess, in the last few, dare I say, months, could be weeks. This is what I mean by you learn on every project. And you have this insight, this revelation, you suddenly think you're very clever, but you're shouting to the world thinking, bloody hell, why are we so dim about this? It's not just us, it's suppliers, isn't it? Our material suppliers. So brick per cubic meter has roughly 550 kilograms of CO2 per cubic meter. A piece of stone cut to the same dimension as a brick has 10% of that, less than 10% of that. Yeah. So I mean, it's a bit of information that I've talked to Niall about. Yeah, the two Nials, because I visited Niall's place up in Falkirk, and of course this lovely Peterson stuff, and it's you know, if the client is demanding that you have, or even your own personal preferences that you somehow fit in, you have a sort of smaller scale component, structural component that you assemble, cut your stone to be the size of a brick. It still looks like brick, and God knows how many different types of stone there are if you want to achieve that color. You'll be less than 10% of the embodied carbon. Combine that with your timber, you're highly likely that as a structure to have a carbon negative building. One last question before I allow somebody else to come in. I think I can see a hand. Were you just scratching your head, or you? No? All right. You got a question? Off you go.
I don't want to sound too rude here, but I was just wondering if all of you feel that you relate to the users of each of your buildings that you've designed. And if you've put yourself in the shoes of those users, like day to day, and if that was part of your design process.
Why don't we start off on this side? Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can call yourself an architect without putting yourself in the empathizing with the user. That's where you start. So I think it's just a given, really. And actually, I think most of the buildings here tonight, the explanations have been a complete explanation of empathy with users and designing the buildings to acknowledge them.
You suggested you were being rude. What's your background? You tell us who you are.
RIBA, but I'm curious. Sorry, I'm from the RIBA, but I'm just curious of the process, because they're such diverse buildings, and I'm sure all of your experience is diverse in your design and your own personal history, and just considering that in the design process of visualizing what that building will mean to the end user. If that's like a constant process that you're thinking about, or it's just at the initial stages, I don't know.
I can say from our point of view with the school, and particularly the school element, we were fortunate enough to work directly with the founding head teacher, the founding governors, and the founding core teaching staff. And so we, as you have seen from our project, it's a school without any corridors, which is not a standard school from the ESFA, Department of Education spreadsheet, because it was a hybrid building and it needed to be different, and we were able to use that. So we feel very fortunate that we could explain our ideas from first principles with the head teacher, weekly meetings, fortnightly, looking at their timetables and analysing that. So it was from day one, it was going to be a different kind of school. We needed them to understand, we needed to understand their needs, the pairing of teaching, the different levels, how small a scale it needed to be. We did examples where the hall would have been semi-sunken to make it even lower, and lots of practicalities. But then when you get into the detail stage, of course, we're looking at where little people are, 4 years old up, accessing to and from, the security issues from the gate, from handover to teachers. You've seen the stable door example. So yeah, it's absolute. And it just happened to be, I live 2 blocks away, and I know about 10 sets of parents with little kids in it. And so the onus was even higher. So yeah, it's intrinsic to design, and hopefully the results and the rewards are definitely because of that.
Thank you. It touches on I guess the question I was asked after my presentation. I mean, we engage with the potential users, but equally there are unknown users for our building. So we try and imagine spaces that can occupy many different types of people, cultures, ideas, forms of inhabitation, events, leisure, seriousness, and time will tell of how that building actually gets used. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know if I'm going off piece by going back to the brick one. I'd quite like to respond on that. I mean, bricks are just a building module. There's a presumption that they're clay and they're hard-fired and use a lot of energy to actually produce them, but that's
not necessarily the case. You can have concrete bricks that are very high carbon. You can have naturally dried in the sun bricks that use no energy to fire them. And as we've used, you can use bricks made out of discarded toilet bowls. And then it uses renewable energy to fire them. So I suppose I'm in sympathy with your commentary about kind of using low embodied carbon materials, but I think brick has a lot of potential. It's much loved. It's what the fabric of the city is largely made of. So I suppose there's a huge opportunity to kind of reevaluate what actually goes into a brick and how it's produced.
Thank you very much. I have the privilege of being a landscape architect to answer the question about the thought of users, so perhaps I offer a slightly different perspective. The spaces that we're designing are often public or they're communal in nature, and we are always thinking about how people are going to start to interact with them, and how are they going to start to experience things like nature within the city and the important role that that can have in terms of well-being and in terms of the kind of improvements to health that that can offer. I think that we also think of users in a slightly broader terms in terms of what actual ecology and biodiversity are things like the planting that we're implementing within our spaces. What is that starting to offer as well to a kind of a broader population within the landscape? So we think of it in a broader sense, and then in a further broader sense, the plants, the plant communities that we're introducing, what are the conditions that those are going to thrive in, and how can we start to create a legacy like the trees that Simon was talking about within his presentation that were planted in 1970. How can we start to provide a legacy of landscape that will last further decades and centuries into the future?
Thank you. I suppose in terms of what's important about a user or a client is from a residential project or within a residential project is that they want to live there and they associate that place as their home. And I think if you can make that happen, then you are 95% of the way to creating a sustainable community where people want to be and want to live. And then whether or not, or how clever you are with how you design a 70 metre square 2-bedroom flat, then obviously there are some people who can do it incredibly well that is going to improve the quality of the life, and other people will do it differently. But actually, if that flat is in the right place and it feels like home, then to me that is the most important thing about how you engage with a client, or how you make places that will last for a very long time.
Okay, doke. I hope that I started to touch on this subject a little bit with our work with FE colleges. I mean, we're privileged, I suppose, as a practice to be able to work with university projects as well. And I think what's interesting about there's a big difference in the sense of what knowledge is about at a university versus an FE college. Knowledge exists as an abstraction in university. It's a given knowledge which is handed down, and it's devoid of, in a sense, connection to a real world. I mean, the wonderful thing I think about the further education college is that the knowledge is always about imparting knowledge from someone to someone else to enable them to then do a job and earn a living. And there's something very, very energizing about that. When you go around and you see it's about cohorts of people becoming something that's going to start them. And I think, in a sense, my reference to Jacobson was this erasing the traces that you've already made, is that you almost want the architecture to be erased and leave the building. Because what you're really concerned about, and what the colleges are really concerned about, we found this in our Glasgow college as well, is that their interest is on the student and how the student gets employment. So next year, if Grangemouth stops producing oil, the college will completely change. As you probably saw, I mean, they're starting to look at renewables and how they train young people to take part in the renewable industry. So I think that's what's very different about it. The architecture almost wants not to be there. And can I say one thing about brick? Because we use brick a lot. Is that, for me, the brick that we were using was about making a cultural connection about a time in British architecture that was optimistic. It was about it was from the 50s, 60s. It was about looking forward, and it was saying there is a future here, guys. It was about light, simplicity, and the brick itself seems to me to have that connection. It's made by hand, and the whole process of the construction industry that we find ourselves often in Scotland is that the making, what you're trying to do is you're trying to erase any idea of making and replace it with assembling. And I think what's interesting about the discussion that we had about quarrying and stone and mass construction is the idea of making seems to be re-entering our vocabulary, which seems to me to be a very good thing.
So in terms of understanding the students that are using the library, I guess first of all, the library was very important to me when I was a student, so I guess I felt a real sense of responsibility to the students to make a place where they would enjoy studying as much as I did. And then I guess practically we had a very good relationship with the librarians at the college, so we had countless conversations with them, and there was lots of surveys done of the students as well, so they got into a lot of detail about, all sorts of things like sort of big scale things, but also little things like how the lights would work and whatnot, and we received that information, so that was very useful, and hopefully
You're getting a very comprehensive answer to your question, aren't you? Very briefly, you're given a brief as an architect, and you're probably going to answer that brief and solve that problem. But I think what you've got to give back is to think about the wider public and the public realm, which isn't necessarily in the brief. And if you go beyond that and talk about carbon, you're really thinking about literally everybody. So we've got a duty to open that up and think about as many people as possible.
Hi there. Again, thanks very much. I thought they were obviously brilliant presentations. I enjoyed absolutely every one of them. I did find it really interesting that every presentation started in a similar way, and that we start with a kind of historical establishing shot of kind of what came before, led to this setting up the design party, and then the kind of execution. And I wanted to ask, what was your personal take on kind of history and context? Because, whether that's kind of like Louis Kahn comes to Cambridge, or, stacked Palladian villas in Hackney, or, a cherry-picked idea of a kind of glass house from 200 years ago in South London, or, housing that is, also displays similar things that exist in Amsterdam as well. There seems to be a bit of an attitude towards history and history making that, are we in danger of sort of ransacking history for sort of motif making and architectural storytelling, and how kind of rigorous do we need to be with the establishing of the history as a design driver?
Can I ask you who you want to direct that to? Because I don't think we have time for a 10-part answer.
Sure. And did you tell us who you were and where you're from?
Rory Keenan, architect, Purcell.
Anybody?
Whoever.
Anybody willing to...
Who wants to take it?
Yeah. Anyone? No, they're all... Oh, there you go. It's volunteered.
I think it's a very, very valid question. And I think there's certainly in relation to a lot of architectural education that was happening in the sort of 70s, 80s and early 90s in terms of modernism positioning itself in relation to history. I think from our point of view, what's so important about history is that it is a record of people's values over time. And in historic and medieval cities, there is those values are readable in the sense that people are drawn to them because they tell stories about different aspects of what the societies were at those times throughout, whether it's 200 years or 500 years or 1,000 years. And so the relevance, I think, is that the way in which we record what we make and how that sits within the history of a city, and it's not about taking historical motifs and repeating them. It's about understanding what was relevant about them and then trying to make things that are relevant to what we do today, but have an equal position within the history of a place.
Are you happy with that answer?
Can I?
Yeah.
I wonder if I could end with a little anecdote. We do smaller projects as well. So we're doing a very small museum on the west coast of Scotland, right on the coast there, in a place called Kilmartin Glen, which is, if anybody knows it, it's famous for its prehistory monuments, stone markings, ring and cup, burial mounds. And we've had a lot of really interesting discussions with the archaeologists. And we were going through, these timelines that everybody draws of Stone Age and Bronze Age and Iron Age. And this Aaron, I forget his second name now, but the archaeologist said, but you have to understand, Neil, that is just a convention to allow lay people like yourself to understand time and when things happened. He said, the issue is we're still in the Stone Age. We're still in the Iron Age. We're still in the Bronze Age. All we're doing is we're adding new ages. So that all of these ages, and if you then, that to me was a kind of light went on and I suddenly thought, that's okay then. Every architectural piece of language that's ever been, not invented, explored, is still available for us.
It is.
It's just an observation, really, but I think this year on the shortlist, all those schemes are amazingly rooted in their place and they're absolutely not interchangeable and they're not abstracted out and could sit anywhere. So I think they've all got a real sense of being rooted in the place, and you go to the context and the history to try and untap the clues and make your building belong.
I think just one quick last thing on the reference thing is that whilst most projects reference maybe one or two references tonight, I'm sure amongst all of us it's 50 references at least that are erased, and some of them are more literal or more obvious than others. It's used as a tool quite often to explain to our clients, to our people, that it gives them comfort that this thing is realized, it can be realized, there's an example, it's part of the story, whilst we're looking at it from different levels, whether it's actually proportion or something else more, less obvious. So I think that's,
Thank you very much. I think we do have to wrap up. I mean, I can see all sorts of gesticulation going on behind you. And we'd love to stay and talk all night, but I think it leaves us really to thank everybody who's come, everybody who's taken part. What a fantastic array of architects and buildings we've seen tonight. To wish you all the best of luck for October the 13th for the Stirling Prize. There are tickets still available, so anyone who wants to go to the event, please log on and buy them. If you don't manage to get to that, or if you manage to get to that and still want more, there is an event on the 25th of October where there's another Building Stories, where the winning architects will be allowed slightly more than 12 minutes to talk about their scheme in more detail. So we would love it if you also came to that. Meanwhile, I think all that's left for me to say is thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Safe journey home.